My wife and I met at a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She was standing in the paint aisle holding two nearly identical shades of white, her brow furrowed like she was diffusing a bomb. I told her the one on the left would look better in natural light. She bought the one on the right. We argued about it for 25 years, and I never once stopped loving her for it. Her name is Sandra. Mine is Michael. We built a life the way most couples do. Slowly, imperfectly, with more love than sense. Some years and more sense than love in others. I was a civil engineer for the county. She taught 4th grade for 18 years before moving into school administration. We had one son, Daniel, who is now 30 and lives 2 states away with his wife and a golden retriever they treat like a third child. We had a house in a quiet neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, with a maple tree in the front yard that turned the most extraordinary color every fall. We had 25 years of mornings and arguments and silences and laughter and everything in between. I thought we were happy. I want to be clear about that. I was not a man who suspected his wife, who checked her phone, who lay awake wondering. I was a man who came home, made dinner twice a week, coached Daniel's Little League team back when that mattered, and fell asleep next to the same woman every night, believing he was the luckiest kind of ordinary. The summer Sandra turned 52, she started going to the gym 5 mornings a week. I thought nothing of it. She said her doctor had told her to get her blood pressure down, and that sounded reasonable to me. Over the next several months, she lost close to 30 pounds. She bought new clothes. She started wearing her hair differently. I told her she looked beautiful, and she smiled in a way that now, looking back, was not quite the smile she used to give me. That fall, she was asked to represent our school district at a regional education conference in Indianapolis. It was a 4-day trip in November, and she was excited about it in a way that surprised me. Not because she wasn't passionate about her work, but because conferences had always bored her before. She usually came home from them exhausted and vaguely irritated. This time, she packed 2 days early. I drove her to the airport on a Thursday morning. She kissed me at the curb and told me not to eat cereal for dinner every night. I told her I made no promises. She laughed, pulled her rolling bag behind her, and walked through the automatic doors without looking back. I sat in the car for a moment before pulling away, and I felt, briefly and for no reason I could name, a small, cold weight somewhere in my chest. I drove home and forgot about it by the time I made it to the highway. My plan for the 4 days she was gone was simple. I was going to clean out the garage. We had been talking about it for 2 years. It had reached the point where you could no longer park both cars inside, and the avalanche risk every time you opened the side door had become genuinely concerning. Sandra had suggested we hire someone. I said I would do it myself. This was, I admit, partly stubbornness, and partly the fact that I knew there were things in that garage that Sandra would throw away without a second thought that I was not ready to let go of old tools from my father, boxes of Daniel's childhood drawings, a fishing rod I had not used in a decade but fully intended to use again someday. I started on Friday morning with coffee and optimism. By the afternoon, I had made real progress. The left side of the garage was cleared, the shelves reorganized, 3 bags of genuine trash by the door. I felt good about myself in the way that only a clean garage can make a man feel good about himself. Saturday, I attacked the back wall and the deep shelving unit that Sandra used for what she called overflow storage, which was her diplomatic term for things she could not decide whether to keep or throw away. There were boxes of old teaching materials, holiday decorations, a broken bread maker still in its original box. I went through everything methodically, setting aside a donate pile, a trash pile, and a keep pile. Near the bottom of the shelving unit, behind a plastic bin of Christmas lights and a rolled-up yoga mat Sandra had bought during a phase that lasted approximately 3 weeks, I found a shoebox. It was an ordinary shoebox, white, from a department store brand, with a lid held on by 2 rubber bands that had partially dried out and snapped when I removed them. I assumed it was an old pair of shoes she had forgotten. I opened it. There were no shoes inside. There was a cell phone. It was an older model, one I did not recognize, in a plain black case. There was a charging cable coiled beside it. There was a folded piece of paper and 2 photographs printed on regular copy paper, folded in thirds. I stood there for a moment with the box in my hands. I cannot explain what I felt right then except to say that the cold weight I had felt at the airport, the one I had forgotten about by the time I reached the highway, came back and did not leave. I took the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. The phone was dead. I plugged in the cable and waited. While I waited, I unfolded the piece of paper. It was a hotel reservation confirmation from a Marriott in Cincinnati, printed more than a year ago for a room booked under the name of a man I had never heard of. A man named Greg Holloway, The dates matched a weekend when Sandra had told me she was visiting her college roommate in Dayton. I sat down. When the phone had enough charge to turn on, I discovered it was not password protected. I wish it had been. I wish I had put it back in the box and returned it to the bottom of the shelving unit and lived the rest of my life not knowing. But I did not do that. I opened it, and what I found over the next 2 hours dismantled 25 years of what I had believed was my life. Text messages going back nearly 2 years. Photographs I will not describe. A calendar of meetings disguised as professional obligations, cross-referenced against dates I now recognized. The weekend in Dayton, a teacher's workshop in Cleveland, an evening she said she had a staff dinner. All of it constructed with a precision that told me this was not carelessness. This was a second life, maintained carefully and in parallel with mine for a very long time. Greg Holloway was, according to what I was able to piece together from the messages, an assistant principal at a school in a neighboring district. They had met at a professional development seminar. That was in the messages too. She had described meeting him, the lunch they had afterward, the conversation that had apparently felt, in her words, like talking to someone who finally understood her. I read that sentence several times. I set the phone down and walked to the backyard and stood in the cold November air for a long time. The maple tree in the front yard had already dropped most of its leaves. The yard looked gray and stripped. I stood there until I could not feel my hands. Then I went back inside. I did not eat dinner. I sat at the kitchen table with the shoebox in front of me and thought about the 25 years. I thought about Sandra in the paint aisle, the wrong shade of white. I thought about the morning Daniel was born and the way Sandra had looked at me afterward, exhausted and luminous, like someone who had just survived something magnificent. I thought about every anniversary, every argument, every Sunday morning, every time she had said, "I love you," and I believed it without question. At some point during that night, I stopped crying and something else began. It was quieter than grief. It was the part of a man that does not fall apart, that begins very calmly to think about what comes next. Sandra called me Saturday evening. I answered. I told her the garage cleaning was going well. I asked how the conference was. She said it was good, interesting, long days. I told her I missed her. She said she missed me too. I listened very carefully to her voice while she said it, the way you listen to a recording of someone analyzing the sound rather than the meaning, and I heard nothing out of the ordinary, which was the most frightening thing of all. After I hung up, I sat with the phone for a while longer. Then I took photographs of every text thread, every relevant message, every piece of evidence that phone contained. I photographed the hotel confirmation and both printed photos. I put everything back in the shoebox and placed it in the back of my own closet on the highest shelf behind a box of old tax returns. Then I made a list. Sunday morning, I drove to a drugstore and purchased a home DNA test. Sandra and I had been careful with birth control for the first years of our marriage, but there had been a window. Daniel was born in our 4th year together. The affair with Greg Holloway appeared to have begun 2 years ago, which meant Daniel's paternity was not in question mathematically. But the phone contained references to a man before Greg, a name mentioned in passing in earlier messages, a Marcus who Greg himself had apparently known about. The timeline of that was less clear. I needed to know. Getting Daniel's DNA without explaining why was not something I was willing to do over the phone. I told him I was doing a family heritage kit, one of those ancestry things, and that I wanted everyone in the family to participate. I mailed it to him with a return envelope. He sent us back within the week, good-natured about it the way Daniel always was, about things that mattered to someone he loved. Monday morning, while Sandra was at work, I drove to my bank and opened a new checking account in my name only. I transferred half of our joint savings. I was not angry when I did this. I was methodical. I went to the insurance office and changed my life insurance beneficiary to Daniel. I stopped at my accountant's office and had a frank conversation I had not anticipated having at 53 years old. Then I called my attorney, a man named Paul Garrett who had handled our wills years ago, and made an appointment for the following afternoon. Paul had worked with Sandra and me together. He was good at his job and careful not to show anything on his face, but he could not entirely conceal his surprise. He asked if I considered counseling before proceeding. I told him I appreciated the question, but that I needed the documents prepared. He prepared them. He also, at my request, drafted an updated will that removed Sandra and left everything to Daniel. I did not tell Sandra any of this. I went home each evening that week and made dinner and watched television and slept in our bed and said goodnight. And I was not cruel about any of it because cruelty was not what I felt. What I felt was the particular silence of a man who has already made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to act on it. The DNA results came back 3 weeks later. Daniel was my son. I read the results twice, then set them down on the kitchen counter and stood there, and I will not pretend I had been certain of the answer. The relief was real, and the relief made the grief sharper, because it meant there was one less thing to be angry about, and one more thing to mourn. That same week, Sandra mentioned, casually, over dinner, that there was a possibility of another conference in the spring. Same organization, she said. It had been such a valuable professional experience. I looked at her across the table. I had looked at this woman across tables for 25 years. I said that sounded like a great opportunity. She smiled and thanked me for being so understanding. I nodded and went back to my dinner. The following Saturday, I woke early, before Sandra was awake, and I packed 2 bags. I took my important documents from the fireproof box in the closet: passport, social security card, the papers Paul had prepared. I took the shoebox. I wrote a note that I left on the kitchen counter under a coffee mug so it would not blow away. The note said only, "I found the phone, Sandra. I know about Greg. I know about Marcus. Don't call me. My attorney will be in touch. His name is Paul Garrett. You have his number from the will we did together. I hope you remember that day, because I do." I left before 7 in the morning. I drove to my brother Kevin's house, which was 40 minutes away in a town called Westerville, and Kevin opened the door in his bathrobe and looked at me and the bags I was holding and did not ask a single question. He just stepped back and let me in, and I sat down at his kitchen table and Kevin made coffee, and eventually I told him everything. Sandra called my cell phone 11 times that Saturday. I did not answer. She called Kevin's landline twice. Kevin told her I was there and that I was safe, and that was all he told her. She called Daniel. Daniel called me, and I answered for Daniel, and I told him that his mother and I were having some serious difficulties and that I needed some time before I could talk about it. Daniel, to his credit, did not push. He said he loved me and to call him whenever I was ready. I thanked him and meant it. I stayed at Kevin's for nearly 2 weeks. During that time, Sandra left voicemails that moved through a predictable sequence. First concerned, then confused, then explanatory in ways that confirmed everything the phone had already told me, then apologetic in a way that I could tell was calculated, and finally tearful in a way that might have been genuine but no longer reached me the way it once would have. I did not respond to any of them. On a Tuesday evening, about 10 days in, Kevin knocked on the guest room door and told me Sandra was outside. She had driven to his house and was sitting in her car in the driveway. Kevin asked me what I wanted him to do. I told him to tell her I would come out in 5 minutes. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor for those 5 minutes. Then I went outside. It was cold. Sandra was standing beside her car with her arms crossed against the chill. She looked like she had not been sleeping. She looked like the woman I had married, and she looked like a stranger, and she looked like both of those things at the same time in a way I did not have language for. She said my name. She said she was sorry. She started to explain the loneliness she had felt, the distance she had perceived growing between us, the way Greg had made her feel seen when she had felt invisible. She said it had meant nothing, and then she stopped and changed that because apparently some part of her could not sustain that particular lie, and said it had meant something but not what we had, not what 25 years meant, not what I meant to her. I listened to all of it. I stood in the cold driveway at my brother's house at 53 years old, and I listened to my wife explain why she had spent 2 years building a secret life parallel to ours, and I let her finish without interrupting. When she was done, I said, "I believe you feel everything you just said. I believe you are sorry. I also believe that you made a decision more than once, every time you sent a message, and every time you drove to a hotel, and every time you came home and said I love you and meant something different by it than I did. You made that decision for 2 years. I made a different one the whole time, without knowing there was another option on the table. That's the part I can't get past. Not the fact of it, the choice of it. Every single day, you chose it." She started crying. I told her Paul Garrett would be in touch about the house. I went back inside. The divorce took 8 months. Sandra contested a few of the financial terms in the early stages, but she had enough self-awareness, or enough guilt, or perhaps enough counsel from her own attorney to not drag it further than it needed to go. We sold the house. I bought a condo closer to the county offices where I still worked. Sandra moved to a smaller house on the other side of Columbus. I heard through Daniel, who remained carefully neutral throughout, and whom I loved fiercely for it, that things with Greg Holloway had not continued after everything came apart. I did not feel satisfaction at that. I did not feel much of anything about it, which surprised me at first and then did not. There was one thing I did that Sandra never knew about. I am including it here because it felt important to me at the time and still does. About 3 weeks after I left, I found Greg Holloway's wife's name through the school district's public staff directory. Her name was Patricia. She was a pediatric nurse. They had 2 children in middle school. I wrote her a letter, printed and mailed, no return address. I told her only what I knew to be facts. The dates, the hotel confirmation, the phone. I told her I was not writing to cause her pain, but because I had wished someone had told me, and I believed she deserved the same chance to make informed decisions about her own life that I had not been given. I sealed it and mailed it and never knew what she did with the information, and I made peace with not knowing. I also made peace eventually with a question I could never entirely resolve, which was not why Sandra had done it, because people give reasons for things and reasons are never the whole truth anyway, but whether any of the 25 years had been real in the way I had believed they were. I do not have a clean answer to that. I have carried it the way you carry a stone in your shoe on a long walk, not crippling, not ignorable, just there, reminding you of itself at odd moments. Daniel and his wife came to visit me 6 months after the divorce was final. They stayed for a long weekend and we ate too much and watched too many football games, and I showed Daniel some of his grandfather's old tools that I had kept from the garage and which now had proper space in my new storage closet. On the last evening, after his wife had gone to bed, Daniel and I sat on the small balcony of the condo with cold beers and didn't say much for a long time. Eventually, Daniel said he was sorry it had happened. I told him I was too, but that I was okay. He looked at me for a moment, the way sons look at fathers when they are trying to determine whether the words and the face match. And then he nodded, and I think we both knew I meant it. I am not going to tell you that I found some triumphant new chapter, because that is not what happened. What happened is quieter and more ordinary than that. I work, I cook. I have taken up fishing again, finally, with the rod I kept from the garage, and it turns out that sitting beside a body of water in the early morning with no particular expectations is a very reasonable thing to do with a Saturday. Kevin and I have dinner most Sundays. Daniel calls twice a week. I think about Sandra sometimes. I think about the paint aisle and the wrong shade of white and the argument we had for 25 years. And I think about the airport curb and the way she did not look back. And I try to hold both of those things without needing to decide which one was the real version of her. Maybe they both were. Maybe that is the most honest thing I can say about any of it. The maple tree in the front yard of the house we sold, I drove past it last October. The new owners had kept it. It was still the most extraordinary color. I pulled over and sat in the car and looked at it for a while. The way you look at something you used to love, at a safe distance, without wanting it back. Then I drove home.